Thanks for tuning in to Research, Design, and Counseling, our discussion of the Heffner text Research, Design, and Counseling, 4th edition, Chapter 11, True Experimental Designs, and Chapter 12, Quasi-Experimental and Longitudinal Designs. I'm Brian Fiddler, and we'll be joined by Kristen Kinsevich, both doctoral students at Regent University. Our outline for this video is we will begin with this brief discussion on a biblical integration understanding of research. Why do we pursue research? And then we will look at true experimental designs, both between groups designs and within subjects designs. Next, quasi-experimental designs, including non-equivalent groups design and also interpreting results. And finally, longitudinal designs, such as simple interpreted time series design and interpreted time series with non-equivalent dependent variable design. Why do we research from a biblical perspective? We're trying to discover truth, seeking wisdom. Of all the innumerable scriptures we could pull to have hours of conversation over this, I just want to highlight a few. First one, it is the glory of God to conceal a matter. To search out a matter is the glory of kings. Proverbs 25:2. Wisdom, like an inheritance, is a good thing and benefits those who see the sun. Wisdom is a shelter as money is a shelter, but the advantage of knowledge is this, that wisdom preserves the life of its possessor. Ecclesiastes 7:11 and 12. Desire without knowledge is not good. How much more will hasty feet miss the way? Proverbs 19:2. And finally, we are invited to turn our ears to wisdom and apply our hearts to understanding from Proverbs 2:2. So we can see from these texts that seeking out truth and wisdom gives us a way to find the way, preserving our life. And also, it is a matter of our own glory, that if God is concealing a matter in his creation, that we are to seek it out. Let's jump into chapter 11 of the text, True Experimental Designs. A true experiment tries to control for all confounding variables so that we can be confident whether or not the treatment caused the change that we're seeing. Some key concepts. In a true experiment, we have an experimental group as well as a control. We have random assignment of participants, and then we have between groups design and within subjects design. Of the between groups design, one is the post-test only control group design, in which the participants are randomly assigned to both the experimental and the control groups. We give the experimental group the treatment, but not the control group, and then we measure the change. This most closely reflects the characteristics needed to attribute a causal relationship. One advantage is that because we're not giving a pretest, we don't have to worry about pretest sensitization or the extra expense that may incur for us, so this averts the issue. One limitation is that without the pretest, we don't have available information the pretest could give us. We also don't know the external validity or generalizability of our research. Another between groups design is the pretest post-test control group design, in which the participants are randomly assigned again to experimental and control groups. The experimental group receives a pretest, then the treatment, then the post-test. The control group receives a pretest and then a post-test. And the advantage is then we use this pretest to help perform analyses that are helpful in making certain inferences about the effects of the independent variable and helping to eliminate error variance. This creates a more powerful statistical test and allows for less participants. We can also use the pretest to help select or deselect participants to our study. And then the limitation is that the sensitizing effect of the pretest. A word about control groups. It's not ethical to withhold treatment from those who may need it when a given treatment is known to work. And so other options we have include a waitlist control group in which the participants in this group at the end of the treatment phase have access to the same treatment as did the experimental group. Another option is the placebo control group in which participants believe that they're receiving a treatment. And then finally, matched control group, in which participants are paired with others in the treatment group. Between groups design also can involve a factorial design. This is when two or more independent variables simultaneously are studied for their impact on a dependent variable. So one example might be a study to measure the effectiveness of two different interventions designed to enhance cross-cultural awareness in students based on gender. This would be considered a 2, gender male, gender female, by 3, treatment 1, treatment 2, and control, post-test only design containing 6 cells. To see what that might look like, you can check out figure 11.3 in the text on page 253. One advantage of the factorial design is that you can see the conditions under which the treatment may operate, such as which gender, a type of intervention, age, or personality of participants, etc. And then a limitation is that this increases the complexity of the research as well as the expense. Another between groups design is the dependent sample designs. This addresses issues that may happen with random assignment of participants to groups. Matches comparable participants based upon a variable may be a variable important for understanding the phenomena being investigated. So for example, if intelligence is important theoretically to the research, it should be considered an independent variable and studied under a factorial design. The matched on the variables first before being randomly assigned to the treatment or the control group, and then analyzed with dependent samples t-test, paired t-test, or correlated t-test. Now within subjects design, the main feature being that there's no control group. Each participant serves as his or her own control, and then random assignment is made to the treatment groups. All participants are exposed to all of the treatment conditions. The randomization involves being randomly assigned to different sequences of the treatments. One example of a within subjects design is the crossover design, in which participants are switched or crossed over to different treatment conditions, usually halfway through the study. The threats to internal validity here include history, in which events may happen between the administration of the treatment, maturation, in which participants naturally develop over time, order effects. It could be that a treatment is more effective if presented as a second treatment, or sequence effects. It could be that a treatment is only effective if following another. Another within subjects design is the counterbalanced crossover design. Control the sequential order threats to internal validity through balancing the order of the conditions or treatments. The participants are randomly assigned to two groups that differ in the order in which they receive treatment. A t-test is used to determine if the order made a difference to the dependent variable. If so, it's controlled for. The advantage is that there are less threats to internal validity and greater statistical power. The limitation is that it takes longer to conduct than the between groups design. And now I'm going to pass it off to Kristen to talk about research design, quasi, and longitudinal.
All right, thanks for that, Brian. Now we're going to cover Chapter 12 regarding quasi-experimental and longitudinal designs. The quasi-experimental design is what I like to call the good enough experiment. It's when you may not be able to conduct what would be known as a true experiment, as Brian described, because you may not be able to have as much control as you'd like over the experiment. That doesn't mean that the research isn't worth doing. And there may be a few reasons that you might not be able to conduct a true experiment. Cost is one factor. Certainly if you have a lot of participants, or if you have a lot of variables to control, then it can be more costly. Secondly, the selection of participants. You may not be able to get as many or as random a sample as you'd like. There's ethical issues around withholding treatment. So to have a true comparison, you have to have one group experience treatment and the other group not, but sometimes that's ethically not a viable option. And there may not be availability of appropriate control groups. So you got to work with what you've got. Now, when you're looking at non-equivalent groups design, it's when your groups are not exactly equal. And so, again, that's okay. The research can be really beneficial, but you need to think through a few problems that you could run into. So if you are using pre-formed groups, this is called a cohort design, It might be therapy groups or school classes that already existed prior to your quasi-experiment. These groups are not randomly selected, and they may not be entirely equal for comparison, but maybe they're good enough. So 2 sixth grade classrooms or 2 cohorts of a group therapy for depression, you may be able to just use what already exists and get enough comparison that it's worthwhile. These groups are not randomly selected, and they might not be entirely equal, and so that's something to consider. It's hard to interpret the results if you only have one group and one post-test. So if you just have one therapy group, let's say, and you just test them at the end, you can't really measure where they started or what the impact of treatment was, and you have no one to compare them to. So you really have to think more broadly than that. If you have multiple groups but still only a post-test, that still might be difficult in a quasi-experiment because the conditions are not controlled quite adequately. And you may only have one group with a pre-test, post-test, and that can be hard to interpret those results as well because you're not necessarily comparing with other treatments. So those are some things to keep in mind. Now, you can interpret your results better if you use a pre-test, post-test design with 2 groups or more. So if you have, let's say, 2 therapy groups that are pre-formed in a cohort already before your experiment, and you test them both beforehand and then again after the treatment, then you have some real data that you can compare, even with your not perfectly aligned or randomly selected groups. You can also use a proxy pretest measure. So if you don't want to condition your group with a pretest and help them to kind of see what you're up to, then you can do some kind of alternative pretests where you can kind of test the equivalencies of groups without giving away your research. You could also use 2 pretests with some time in between to account for maturation. And you can use a reverse treatment with a pre-test and post-test design. So you can manipulate the treatment to try to get opposite outcomes between the 2 groups. One group you expect to go in one certain direction, maybe improve on one area, and the other group might improve in a different area or decrease in a different area, so that you're trying to show that the treatment is what caused the change. Now, time series designs, or as we may say, longitudinal experiments, those are, when research is really in it for the long haul. And so the basic way to do this is a simple interrupted time series design, and it's basically making multiple observations over time, and then you have treatment, and then you make additional observations over time. This allows the researcher to detect maturational changes, and you can also observe seasonal trends. So I did include the example of every first week of December, doctoral students have a higher level of stress. Perhaps you could relate to that. Now, an interrupted time series with non-equivalent dependent variables, basically that's fancy for measuring 2 different things at once for a long time. So typically researchers expect one variable to change in this circumstance and the other one to remain the same, hence they're not equivalent. So if you're looking to measure something and you want to prove that the treatment changed that one thing and changed the thing you expected to change, and the other variable that you're looking at you didn't expect to change and that remains the same, then it kind of gives a little bit more credence to the fact that the treatment is doing what you want it to do. Treatment can be introduced after multiple observations, and 2 or more variables are studied following that treatment. Now, you also can do an analysis of concomitance, which is really fancy for whether a change in one variable leads to a change in another. Some of those terms can be confusing, but it's really a pretty simple concept. The example they gave in the book was, does a counselor's self-disclosure lead to increased amounts of client self-disclosure? So you're doing one thing and you're changing one variable, and then does that change another variable? So you might actually look at what increases a counselor's willingness or ability to use self-disclosure, and then does that lead to a change with clients? And this design can be helpful in creating predictive measures. Now let's end with a final integrative thought, When we as researchers embrace a long-term view of our studies, we can choose to enter into an eternal perspective. So as a Christian, we can ask, what is the value, the kingdom value, in the subject that I hope to study long-term? And what eternal truths can be uncovered when I observe something over a long period of time? I think it's important to embrace the spiritual practice of patience as well, and slowly arriving as you consider longitudinal research design. It might just be good for your spiritual life. Now let's just sum up here for the things Brian and I have covered in this video. A true experiment between groups controls as many variables as possible, randomly assigns groups, and involves a control group. You can also conduct a true experiment within subjects using a pre- or post-test method to measure the change. And you have to keep maturation in mind and use counterbalance methods in order to eliminate natural growth as variable. Sometimes in the real world, you can't conduct a true experiment, but there's still value in a quasi-experiment when you compare existing cohorts. Research conducted longitudinally can provide some unique insights that account for maturation and can look at multiple variables and seasonal changes. And let's remember that the quest for truth is a deeply spiritual and scientific one. Remember to connect with your inner truth seeker as you conduct your research. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and if you'd like to contact us, there's our email addresses. Hope you enjoyed this video.